One important aspect for many kinds of and traditions of philosophy that sometimes doesn't get enough attention is what we can call the practical side of it. And I don't just mean ethics as such, but engaging in philosophical practices. So what we have there is partly ethics, partly psychology, and a couple other things rolled in together. And what we find in a lot of philosophy and philosophers when we're paying close enough attention is that they either directly suggest to us, hey, you should do this, and it should have this kind of effects on your outlook, your mood, your ability to handle things. Or there might be aspects of their philosophy that can be, they're only implicit, but they can be developed into those kinds of philosophical practices. And I do want to say something at the very beginning here, which is that there's a lot of different terms out there for let's call them the many different practices that we can find, not just in ancient, but also in medieval and modern philosophy. And we can find them not just in Western, but also a lot in non-Western philosophical texts and thinkers as well. So sometimes they're called philosophical practices. Pierre Hadot prefers the term spiritual exercises. He is a key figure who coined the phrase philosophy as a way of life and identified this as being absolutely central to ancient Western philosophy, but is also something that goes into early and monastic Christian philosophy and emerges at certain points in modern philosophy. We have Michel Foucault, who also talks about technologies of the self. We have Martha Nussbaum, who will talk about certain philosophical arguments as therapeutic arguments that are supposed to have a similar sort of effect on the person's soul or psyche in helping them deal with things. And she finds these in ancient philosophy as well. And we could go on and on and on. The term itself is not that important. What is important is noticing that whether we're talking about the Stoics and Epicureans or going further back to Aristotle and Plato and their texts and what they're offering us, or forward all the way into 20th century existentialism or other types of philosophy, we can find people providing us with philosophy as a matrix of things that we can experiment with, things that we can try out, perhaps even make into something like a habit or a tool that, to use Epictetus's phrase, is ready at hand when we need it. Some schools really focused heavily on this. I've brought up the Stoics. When you look at the texts that we have from Seneca, from Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Musonius Rufus, and the others that we have, you're going to see lots and lots and lots of exercises like this. And you could say, well, what about Plato or what about Aristotle? Well, we find that, Plato has some that are sketched out like this, but there's also a lot of later Platonists who will also talk about these things. The Epicureans had practices. The Cynics had practices. And this continues on into the philosophy when Judaism and Christianity are encountering Greek and Roman philosophy and assimilating some of these practices. They develop some others of their own. And it goes on well into the Middle Ages, and it even goes into the early modern period where we see people like at the very beginning, at the end of the Renaissance, Montaigne or René Descartes at the early beginnings of modernity. He has an entire book called Meditations on First Philosophy, and that's not just a bunch of arguments or sitting there thinking by yourself. It's supposed to be a bunch of meditations. And he says that quite explicitly in the text and in his replies to various critics. And we could go on and on and on and multiply examples, but we don't really need to spend too much time on that. One thing I do want to sort of close with, I mentioned that in some cases we have clearly, explicitly defined philosophical practices. When you encounter this sort of situation, do this thing and it should have this effect. Or why don't you try thinking about this each day, or meditate upon this, or sometimes even reading itself can be a practice. But we also have a lot of other ideas that aren't themselves already practices, but could be, with just a little bit of work, transformed into philosophical practices. So, for example, Aristotle has a lot of interesting discussions of anger as an emotion and how we should evaluate it from moral and psychological perspectives. He doesn't come straight out and say, and these are practices that you can use, but it only takes a few steps to say, aha, Aristotle gave us some ideas here, some distinctions, some ways of saying, if we think this is likely to happen. Or here's the way we ought to get angry, and here's ways that people go wrong with it. We can, with just a little bit of work, turn those into philosophical practices, and that is often what people do when they are treating philosophy in this way, not just as something that we go off into our study and grab some books and read and think, but something that applies to our broader life as human beings. Philosophy as something to develop the entire human person, the intellect, our reasoning capacities, but also our emotions, our drives, our desires, our relationships, our assumptions, our outlooks. All of these sorts of things connect together. And so if we take a more practical approach to philosophy, if we adopt that lens, we are going to find that there are many, many practices. Now, the last thing that I'll say is, if you're interested in this aspect of philosophy, you get to experiment with it. There's nothing like actually trying out practices to see whether or not they bear fruit for you. And this involves actually doing things with philosophy. And you can't do everything all at once, so you have to be, to some degree, selective about which practices you want to incorporate. So that's another interesting aspect to it. There are, you could say, paths that you can take. There's a Stoic path, there's a Cynic path, there's an Epicurean path, there's all sorts of different ways you can go. And they'll say you should do this and this and this and this along that way. But it's up to you to decide what you want to try out and put to the test through experimentation and checking out the experience of what philosophy does to transform your life, you as a person, your mindset, your emotional responses, and your relationships with other people. So, very important aspect of philosophy that sometimes doesn't get enough attention, but you might find very, very helpful or fruitful if you play around with it.